I wanted to start by giving a quick tool flyover on what's needed to disassemble this engine core. Pretty basic tools here. We have a 1/2 inch drive impact, snap on, 3/8 drive impact, snap on, 5/16 nut driver, a couple of metric studs for the crankshaft. You'll see that in the video. We have a C7 head bolt altered into a lifting bracket or lifting eye for the block. We also have a 18mm deep well socket, 16mm socket, 15mm 12 point for the rod bolts, 13mm deep well, 10mm 12 point as well. They're all snap-on sockets. We have a 20mm 12 point snap-on socket altered a little bit to work properly in this C7 head, and a snap-on adapter inside of it, 1/2 inch to 3/4. 21mm 1/2 inch drive socket for the flywheel housing, and then a 16mm socket as well. Also got a lifting eye for the cylinder head. We got a 3/8 extension with a 13mm socket that comes in handy for the piston cooler nozzles. A couple of hammers, snap-on dead blow ball peen, and then a pry bar to rotate the engine. Pretty basic stuff. So let's see if we can make this happen. For time's sake, I've already disassembled this Caterpillar C7 engine core. We've got our block and our head on the pallet ready to send to the machine shop. We've got our crankshaft out, our old pistons. So now we're going to get ready to show you how to properly assemble this C7 engine. You just want to remove all 7 of your main caps. This is an inline 6 diesel engine. Our block is standard back to factory Caterpillar specs. And remove all 7 main caps. You'll see I'm going to show you how to just wipe the bearing surfaces clean before we put the main bearings in. So this is the first step on reassembling this Caterpillar C7 engine. This block is professionally machined at a machine shop we trust, that we use. You definitely want to pick and choose wisely on a machine shop to do your machine work. They did this block and our cylinder head that you'll see later in the video. So you've got 7 main bearings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 are all the same. Number 6 is actually your upper thrust bearing. It is the thrust bearing for this engine. You saw I just put it in there. So we've got our upper main bearings in. We're going to install some Lucas assembly lube. That's what I like to use on my bearing surfaces. Here in a second you'll see we have our crankshaft already clean, standard, ready to go back in, and it's going to be a 2-man lift. This is a smaller little 7-liter engine, so you don't really need a big chain or hoist for some of the components. You want to pay attention to which direction you put this crankshaft in. I always like to put, obviously the crankshaft gear is going to be in the front, so you got to identify where the gear train is going to be. And then we've got our caps and our lower crankshaft bearings, and just install them in the main caps. The caps are numbered, you'll see here in the video. We'll make sure that you not only get them in the right spot, but also in the right orientation. This particular engine, they go tang to tang. A lot of main caps might have a marking that say to the front or a part number, but you just want to make sure you pay attention to how the main caps go on. This one's numbered. You're going to see it's going to be number 7, and we'll go down the line. You just want to hand tighten these bolts all the way up the line, and then we'll show you how to torque and then turn these main bolts. Once the main bolts are torqued and turned, your crankshaft is officially installed and ready to go to the next step. I use a small ball peen hammer to seat the main cap down and lightly run the main bolts in. And we're going to torque these Caterpillar C7 main bolts to 45 foot-pounds. 45 foot-pounds. Always double check your torques. You'll see through the video, always double check everything. We're going to take an ink marker and we're going to turn these bolts 90 degrees. Everybody has their own way of turning main bolts or bolts in general. These are 6-point bolts. I always just draw a straight line and then turn it 90 degrees. You want to check your rotation of your crankshaft and make sure it spins freely by hand, and then also you can check your thrust. The next step is, with the top side down, we're going to install the flywheel housing. This way we can install the flywheel housing and eventually stand the engine up on the flywheel housing to move to the next step. This particular engine does not have a gasket. It uses a gasket eliminator. I use the Detroit Red Jelly. And we're going to install the back cam plate and then the flywheel housing. We actually have another video of this same engine on how to properly install a Caterpillar C7 rear engine seal, which you'll see in this video as well. I use lineup studs to guide the flywheel housing into place, and then once everything's bolted up and tight, obviously remove them. If you guys and girls are liking these videos, please like and subscribe. We're going to continue to do these videos and help y'all out as much as we can. These are educational videos, and hopefully, if you're trying to learn the industry or just simply want to know what your mechanic's doing behind the doors in the shop, and just keep watching. We got a lot of material out there. We've got our Caterpillar C7 genuine seal. We like to use genuine OEM parts if they're available, and of course having the right tool here is most definitely needed. You don't want to drive this rear main seal in with a hammer and a punch. It actually has a wear sleeve that mates onto the crankshaft inside the seal, so it's all got to be pulled up in unison. You can see the wear sleeve inside the seal. Also on rear main seals, you want to pay attention to the rotation. A lot of times you can have the same diameter seal but different colors, and you basically want to look for an arrow on the seal for the rear main seal, and it should point counterclockwise. And then, if you're ever installing a front main seal, the rotation arrow should be mounting clockwise. And at this point, you want to run the seal in till it stops. Let the tool do its job. And there you have it. So now we're going to stand this engine up on the flywheel housing, as you'll see, and we are ready to move to the next step. We are doing this with a forklift boom and a chain. We do not have an overhead hoist in the shop, but you just want to have a good heavy duty lift and eyes and the proper equipment. So as you can see, this is our machine block, crankshaft installed. Everything's nice and clean, and let's move on to the next step. Now I'm going to show you how to properly assemble the 6 piston and rod assemblies. Today we're using an IPD piston kit. standard bearings as before. We've got some basic tooling here. We've got our snap ring pliers and our piston ring pliers and the Lucas assembly lube. I've already cleaned and inspected all 6 rods. We are reusing our rods. And let's go ahead and unpack this and get started. First thing I do is install one snap ring on one side of the piston. Just use your standard old snap ring pliers. You want to properly install the snap ring. In other words, you want to make sure it's seated. It would be a bad day if a snap ring's not in place and about the first 20 minutes of the engine running you fling a rod out the side of the block. So we've got our snap ring installed. Next, I'm going to show you how to install the piston rings. Just like any diesel engine, you've got three piston rings. Your oil control ring, you have an intermediate ring, and then you have your top piston ring. With the piston body down, we're going to install the oil control ring first. And you'll see there's a mark there that you want to identify on the gap of the oil ring. So install the inner part of the oil control ring first, as you can see, and then the outer part of it goes next. Anytime you're assembling piston rings, there's always identifying marks on the rings. Typically all the markings go up. Sometimes there's paint markings that all line up on one side. You really want to pay close attention to the manufacturer's recommendations on this. This one has a yellow mark that goes in the gap of the oil control ring, so if you got it lined up, you know you're good. As you can see, I assemble my pistons top side down. It's just personal preference. Some people do it in a vise with the rod already on it, but this is just how I do it, so follow along. These IPD parts are really good parts. They've been building Caterpillar aftermarket parts since the 60s. I've personally used these parts for going on 15 years now, and very, very proud of them. It's good stuff. However, I do not recommend IPD gaskets and seals. If you can use genuine, OEM, Caterpillar, Cummins, whatever it may be, I highly recommend OEM gaskets and seals. So with the piston ring pliers, we're installing the intermediate ring, the middle ring, if you will, and then last but not least, the top piston ring. Like always, you want to be real clean in anything you're doing assembling these engines. You want to be in a clean environment, clean workstation. Make sure all your parts are clean. We actually have a big industrial parts washer we use at our shop with a steam cleaner behind it. So once you get all 3 piston rings on the piston body, you want to stagger these rings. You don't want all the gaps lined up in one spot. You definitely want to stagger them evenly. So now we're gonna put some more Lucas assembly oil, and then we're gonna install our rod and our wrist pin. I do want to note that your rod orientation goes into play on this engine just like any other engine. You want to pay attention to how the rods come out of the piston bodies when you disassemble an engine. These C7 pistons, I don't know if you can see, but there is a marking on the piston body that says front. So we're gonna assemble all 6 of these pistons the same way with the rod orientation. This particular engine is going to go tang to the driver's side. In other words, part number of the rod is going to go to the front along with the marking on the piston body. and slide your wrist pin in. Make sure everything's moving freely. And then we're going to install the last snap ring. I can't stress enough how important it is to pay attention to how the snap ring goes in and locks properly. You want to make sure that it's seated properly. Check, double check, triple check, ever what you got to do. If you look at our rod, these are fractured cut rods. You just want to pay close attention there again to how the rod caps go on and the numbering on the rod. You want to make sure you have the right rod cap on the right rod. Go ahead and install our rod bearings. And that piston assembly is installed, so repeat 5 more times. Now that the piston assemblies are installed, we've got some basic tooling here again. We're going to get ready to show you how to install this piston body assembly. I always put regular old 15W40 engine oil on the piston body and rings. When assembling the piston, it makes life a lot easier. Want to make sure there again your rings are still staggered properly. And this is the ring squeezer I'm going to use today. We have a blue million different ring squeezers in the shop, but this one works good for the C7s. You'll see I have a small dead blow hammer, and it's what I use to knock the pistons into the machine block. I also want to note, you'll see here in just a second, this block is a dry sleeve block. It's not a wet sleeve. There's not a liner to pull and pull. You know, that's where the machine shop come into play and professionally machine the block back to standard bore. I'm gonna put some oil on the rod bearing, and we are ready to install this piston. Now, we want to rotate the crankshaft to whichever 2 cylinders you're ready to install. And we're going to install 1 and 6 first. So you want to turn the crankshaft to that position. You want the number 1 and 6 rod down. We've got our front marking on the piston body. And typically we like to have 2 people at this point to guide the rod bearing around the crankshaft as it comes down. Sometimes you need to hold the rod up a little bit to get it to seat on the crankshaft properly. As you can see, our fracture cut rods we're using today, we've got the right part numbers matching. Just want to pay close attention with all this. So we've got a 1/2 inch torque wrench to turn the rod bolt. We've got a 3/8 torque wrench to torque it initially. We're going to torque these rod bolts initially to 45 foot-pounds, and then with our 1/2 inch tech angle wrench, we're going to turn the rod bolt 120 degrees, and you'll see all this in the video. So you want to pull the rod down till it stops onto the crankshaft, and then we're going to hand tighten these rod bolts. use a little electric impact to run the rod bolts up for time's sake. You don't want to hammer too tight because you're about to have to torque the rod bolt. We've got a 15 millimeter 12-point socket we're using to torque this rod bolt. So again, we're going 45 foot-pounds, and then we're going to turn the rod bolt with a tech angle wrench 120 degrees. The tech angle wrench comes into play on 12-point bolts. Turning the 120 degrees or whatever it may be, it makes life really easy. And there we have it. And you'll see, I'm gonna make sure you check the thrust on the rod. You want to make sure it's moving up and down as well. So I've already installed the other 5. As you can see, we have our rotating assembly assembled, and I just want to give you a visual of what we've done so far. So the next step is we're going to install our piston cooler nozzles. Those go in last after the pistons are installed. I wanted you to see how it goes in the block and actually squirts oil onto the piston body and wrist pin assembly. Got an extension and a 13 millimeter socket. These little bolts torque to 22 foot-pounds. These are little M8 bolts, kind of a standard torque with any M8 bolt. This particular cylinder we're showing you in the video is number 2. And that's it. So you can see all 6 piston cooler nozzles that we've installed now in our rotating assembly. Now that we have our piston assemblies and crankshaft installed to our block, we're going to install the oil cooler housing. Got a genuine Caterpillar gasket kit here. We've got lineup studs in the block, as you can see, and we're just going to install these gaskets and seals with the oil cooler assembly. The lineup studs make life a lot easier installing stuff like this. Got 2 O-rings that go on the block, 1 gasket, and then I'm going to install the oil cooler element. Everything's cleaned and inspected, ready for install. I just use a 3/8 impact 13 millimeter socket. You don't have to torque these bolts. I don't torque them. I just run them down with an impact and be done with it. Now we're going to install the water pump assembly. This is a Caterpillar remanufactured water pump. 2 O-rings, 4 bolts, and it's ready to bolt up to the block. Our C7 long blocks come not only with machine block, new pistons and rings and bearings, rebuilt head, we also install a new water pump as well. Now I'm going to show you how to install the idler gear front housing and then the camshaft. So pay close attention here. We have our idler gear, we have the plate that it goes on, and just pay attention to how all this goes together. The idler gear goes between the crankshaft gear and the camshaft. It has to be installed before we put the outer front cover on, or the timing cover. So this is the hub that the idler gear rides on. It's got a little bolt that goes in, 10mm socket, 12 point. And then there's two other bolts behind it that are 16mm socket. We'll tighten them down. Lucas oil again, and we've got the crankshaft turned to top dead center at this point, and then the idler gear has a dot on it. You'll see in a second that we're going to line up that eventually will time to the camshaft. So you want to line the timing dot up to the dot on the crankshaft, as you can see right here. The other dot right there will go to the dot on the camshaft. Once the camshaft is installed, those timing reference points are matched up. You know your engine is timed up properly. We actually have the crankshaft pinned to top dead center, and it'll be TDC1 once the camshaft goes in. These bolts are going to torque to 46 foot-pounds, 3/8 torque wrench. You can see our pistons up on TDC1. Now we're ready to install our front cover. I've got some blue Loctite that I like to use on the front housing bolts. I've got our Detroit red jelly, our gasket eliminator. There's not a gasket in between the block and the housing. It's just this gasket eliminator I'm showing you here in the video. You don't want to get too carried away on this gasket eliminator. You want to spread it thin. Go ahead and put the Loctite on your bolts, and we're getting ready to install this front cover. Pretty easy stuff at this point. There are dowels in the block. There's 2 dowels, and they simply line up with the cover itself. Pretty cut and dry stuff. You may need a small little hammer just to tap the housing down onto the dowels to get it properly seated. We're going to run these down with a 3/8 impact, and then eventually torque all of these bolts. These are the M8 bolts we talked about earlier. We're going to torque those to 22 foot-pounds. Now these bolts I'm installing now are just there to hold things in place. Eventually the front engine mount will be bolted where these 4 bolts are going down right now. Now we're going to install our camshaft. It is cleaned and inspected. I'm going to put some assembly lube down the cam bearings. These are new cam bearings, again, in our machine block. You want to make sure you get everything lubed up nice. We've got our blue Loctite, our cam retainer, and 2 bolts. And you'll see we're going to slide the camshaft in from the top side. This engine is still standing on the flywheel housing. You want to be real careful installing the camshaft. You don't want to damage the cam bearings when you're installing it, so you want to be nice and slow and gentle. Now we've lined our markings up to the idler gear you saw earlier in the video. That way we know we're in time. We're going to install the cam retainer and 2 bolts, and we're going to torque those to 22 foot-pounds as well. Now the camshaft is turning freely. Our timing marks are lined up. We are officially in time. Now we're going to install the outer front cover. We have a gasket, studs, and eventually the front cover. And then I'm going to show you how easy it is to install the front seal. There is not a seal installer for the front. It is pretty cut and dry. I use a small rubber mallet to tap it in, and then a brass punch to lightly make sure it's seated into the right depth. This front seal does have an arrow on it as well, a genuine cat seal, and the arrow should be pointing clockwise. Make sure you're using the right seal. You don't want to get too carried away beating this seal in. Now we have our short block assembly assembled, and we're going to set this in the engine stand to get ready to move on to the next step. Now we're going to install our cam follower assemblies. We have these dowels that go into the block. There are 6 of them. These line the cam follower assemblies up into the block. We got our gaskets here, cam follower gaskets, and then eventually our cam follower assemblies. The center cam follower assembly acts as a blow-by housing as well. We're going to install the rear one first. These cam follower assemblies have been cleaned and inspected. And you'll see they hold themselves in place with them dowels we installed earlier. And we've got a handful of bolts, M8 bolts again. As you can see on the center cam follower assembly, that's where the blow-by assembly bolts up as well. I've got 2 fasteners on the center assembly as well. That's for your wiring harness to zip tie to later on. And just run them in nice and evenly all the way around. Now we have our head gasket. We're getting ready to install our rebuilt cylinder head. This is a genuine Caterpillar gasket. We have our block cleaned and wiped down. This head gasket, just like any others, has markings. Typically the markings go up, but we're gonna, with a lint-free towel, wipe everything down and install our head gasket. As you can see there, that was our part number. It is up. All right, lint-free towel again. We're gonna wipe our cylinder head down and set it on the block. Now we're gonna install our head bolts. Run them down nice and evenly with an impact. Pretty self-explanatory. With the engine in the engine stand, this is important. When we get ready to torque these head bolts, that keeps the engine from sliding around. We're going to torque these head bolts to 345 foot-pounds. You always want to start in the center and work your way out. I'm using a 3/4 inch snap-on torque wrench. You want to start from the center and work out, and eventually you'll see I double check everything for the final torque. The smaller head bolts are actually in, and I didn't show it in the video, but they are actually torqued as well. Now that our cylinder head is on and torqued, we're going to install the valve bridges on the intake valves, and then eventually the rocker arm assembly. It is one complete rocker assembly, you'll see. I put Lucas assembly lube again on top of the valve stems, and then install the valve bridges on the intake valves. Now we're installing the rocker assembly. I've cleaned and inspected the rockers as well. This is one assembly, so I actually bolt the rocker assembly down and torque it before I install the push tubes. You'll see this here in a minute in the video. Run everything down finger tight, and eventually with the impact, and then torque. I torque the rocker assembly bolts to 78 foot-pounds, and there's two smaller bolts at the rear of the rocker assembly, and those torque to 22 foot-pounds. Just like head bolts, I like to start in the center and then work my way out. And finally the last two. I have everything numbered here for video purposes. I want you to follow along with me. I'm going to loosen all the adjustment nuts down the line, and we're going to install the push tubes one at a time. I'm going to install the push tubes in our valve adjustment sequence. So on TDC 1, we're going to adjust intake 1, 2, and 4. And then we're going to adjust exhaust 1, 3, and 5. So you'll see that's the cylinders and the location that I'm going to install the push tubes. These push tubes are going down into the cam follower assemblies that I showed you earlier. And we're just going to finger tight everything for now. And then eventually we're going to come back and I'm going to show you how to make your valve adjustment. There again, we've got intake on 1, 2, and 4, and exhaust 1, 3, and 5. So now that the push tubes are installed on them cylinders, we're going to adjust first the intake valves. Those are going to 15 thousandths. We have a 15 thousandths feeler gauge. And we're going to go ahead and adjust 1, 2, and 4. When you adjust valves, you want a slight drag when you pull the feeler gauge out. You don't want it too tight or too loose. You just want it to be nice and snug on your feeler gauge. As you can see, we're doing the intake first at 15 thousandths. Next, we're going to do the exhaust. The exhaust adjusts to 25 thousandths. So 15 thousandths on the intake valves, 25 thousandths on the exhaust. The exhaust on TDC1, as we're still on, we're going to adjust 1, 3, and 5. Now we're going to rotate our engine 360 degrees, and you'll see on the marking we went 360. Now we're on top dead center 6, TDC 6, and we're going to install the push tubes according to that sequence. On TDC 6, we're going to install push tube on intake 6, 5, and 3, and then exhaust is going to be 6, 4, and 2. And now we're going to adjust the valves accordingly. We're going to do intakes first and then exhaust. We're doing 15 thousandths on the intake. Intake is going to be 6, 5, and 3. Fifteen thousandths on 6, 5, and 3 on TDC 6. Now we're going to do the exhaust 25 thousandths feeler gauge. It's going to be 6, 4, and 2. 25 thousandths on 6, 4, and 2. And that will complete our valve adjustment. I do like to go back and double check my tightness on my nuts, as you'll see in the video. So now our rocker assembly is installed, torqued, and our valves are adjusted, and we're ready to move to the next step. Now we're going to bolt up our exhaust manifold. Pretty easy. Line up studs again. Genuine Cat exhaust manifold gaskets. Pretty cut and dry here. This is definitely going to be one of our long block assemblies. The customer is going to use their wiring harness, ECM, a lot of externals. They're also going to use their fuel system on our engine. Now we're going to bolt up our thermostat housing with a new hose and clamps. Don't cut corners on little thing. I think that hose is like $5 brand new. Put new clamps and hose in between your new water pump and the thermostat housing with new thermostats. Just small things we like to do on our rebuilt components to get the life out of the engine that you really want. Pretty cut and dry here. Our manifold's bolted up on the passenger side. Thermostat housing going on, new gaskets and seals. And you'll see here in a minute, this particular engine takes 2 thermostats in the thermostat housing. As an option on our long blocks, we can add on a fuel system, which is basically a new Huey pump, 6 injectors, and an ICP sensor. It's like a $4,500 option that we offer. When installing the 2 thermostats in the thermostat housing, you want to make sure you have the right gasket to go along with it. There's a gasket, which you'll see here in a second, that takes for 2, and then there's also a gasket that only takes 1. So you just want to pay close attention to what comes out of there. Now we're going to install our valve cover base / rocker assembly. I have installed a brand new injector harness in this rocker box. Every long block we sell will have a new injector harness installed as well. There again, it's like $300 harness. Why cut corners and put a used one in it? That'll create problems down the line. So we're gonna bolt this up, and then you'll see the intake going on here in a minute. We're getting real close to the completed long block assembly. I just wanted to show you the top end of this engine before we cover it up. Everything's ready for the injectors to be installed or re-O-ringed and then installed, depending on what the customer decides. Got our intake manifold gasket, line up studs again, our intake manifold. There again, the customer's gonna reuse all his sensors and wire and harness and ECM on our long block, just like you'd get from Caterpillar. I hope you guys and girls have enjoyed these videos and find them helpful. This is our finished product on our engine stand. We sell these engines exchange. We do get the core back eventually on our stand. And there you have it. Thank you for watching.